Suspensions and retardations are probably most simply conceptualized as delayed resolutions of otherwise chordal pitches. So it's very similar in terms of the pitch content to what you would see in standard resolutions, such as you see in front of you now. But what's happening is you have pitches that you can almost think of as overstaying their welcome, or sort of lingering around into another chord to which they don't belong, and then finally resolving by step just after that lingering moment. So we'll use this example to look at a few of these examples, especially suspensions, which tend to be a little bit more common. So what I want to do first is, just in terms of kind of getting a basic understanding, I want to go ahead and label the intervals between each of my upper three voices and the bass in each of these three chords. So I will start with the tenor. The tenor begins at an octave above the bass. And then by the time we get to the 5/7 chord, now the tenor is a third above the bass. And then finally the tenor ends up back at the octave above the bass. The alto begins as a fifth above the bass. It becomes the chordal seventh in the 5/7 chord, so now it's a seventh above the bass. And finally it resolves as a third above the bass. The soprano begins as a third above the bass. Soprano steps down into C sharp, becoming a fifth above the bass's new pitch, the F sharp. And finally, the soprano resolves at the octave. So the reason I've done this labeling, it's not necessarily important that we do it all the time in analysis, but what I want to do is I want to illustrate kind of some of the most common suspensions that we have. Our common suspensions are named in terms of the intervals of the suspending voice, which is one of the upper three voices usually, which we'll talk about the bass in just a second, but the intervals between that voice and the bass, and we use the simplified versions of the intervals. So even if there's more than an octave between, we'll still just use the simple interval. So our common suspensions are 7/6 suspensions, 4/3 suspensions, and 9/8 suspensions. And these are the types of suspensions that don't involve bass motion. So in other words, the bass stays the same throughout the suspension and resolution episodes. And then there is a common bass suspension that we identify, which we call the 2/3 suspension. Now, one thing you might notice is that in each of the first three examples, the interval is shrinking as the suspended note resolves down. Again, this is the case when the suspensions occur in the upper three voices. Well, the bass itself can suspend, but because suspensions resolve down and because the bass is the lowest voice, it's actually going to widen its space from the note against which we interpret as suspending. And we interpret the bass as suspending from whichever pitch above it, whichever of the three upper voices causes the dissonance. So this commonality of the 2/3 suspension implies that there's typically going to be a voice above the bass that is a step above the bass when its suspension occurs, or a step plus any number of octaves. So these are the typical suspensions. And the reason I want us to recognize that is I want us to see these numbers I have in purple here as potential resolutions to a possible suspension. Okay, so when I look at the second and third chords, I want to think about ways I could potentially suspend. If I start with the soprano and I look at the 5, well, none of the examples above really result in a 5. I will say there is such a thing as a 6/5 suspension, and I suppose sometimes we could put it on the common list, so maybe 5 is a candidate. And so we have a 7th in the alto. Well, that's not usually the result of a suspension. We don't really recognize an 8/7 suspension so much, so it's probably out of the running. Now, we see that we have a 3rd in the tenor, and we see that the 3rd is in fact a result of a 4/3 suspension, so that's a potential candidate. And now moving over to the next chord, we have an octave in both the soprano and the tenor, and we do have the option of a 9/8 suspension, so that's probably possible. And then we have a 3rd in the alto above the bass. So that, again, could be the result of a 4/3 suspension. So as I'm learning to work with suspensions, if I can learn to identify how they might resolve based on my basic voice leading, that might help me get a nice handle on these things. So here's how I can create a suspension. Let's take, for example, the very first clear opportunity I think we have, which is the tenor. So what I'll do is delay the arrival of the A sharp in this tenor. Okay, I'll delay it by suspending or sustaining the previous pitch the tenor held, which in this case is a B, and that B will still be around once the rest of the chord arrives. So that's why we call it a suspension, because it suspends or it stays in place. And then finally what we'll do is we'll resolve that B down to an A sharp, which is now the chordal pitch. Okay, so it's a suspension. It begins its life as a chord tone, right? Because a B is chordal to the one chord. In fact, it's helping to double the root of the chord. But as it lingers around, by the time the new chord arrives, it's no longer chordal. So B is not a part of a 5/7 chord. However, after it lingers, it's going to resolve down. Suspensions always resolve down. And by the time it resolves, that new note now is part of the chord. So that's how suspensions tend to work. So here's how we label our suspensions. Because there are those three phases where the note begins as a chordal pitch, it suspends as a non-chordal pitch, and then it resolves down to a chordal pitch again, we want to label each of those episodes. So we call the point at which the note appears as part of a chord, we call that the preparation. So we'll use the letter P to indicate that preparation. And then at the moment of suspension itself, we will label that with an S. And then when it finally resolves, we will label that with an R. And we want to find some way to kind of group all of this together so it's very clear which pitches we're talking about. You can use a circle like this. Sometimes we use brackets, and those brackets clearly indicate the voice that we're labeling. Okay, so just something that kind of ties all of those things together: the suspension, the preparation, the suspension, and the resolution. And we also want to be mindful, even if we don't always label it, that what we do have is a 4/3 suspension. One of my favorite ways to label suspensions is actually to do so according to what I have in my Roman numeral. So what I might do is I have to remember that a 7, that this interval is actually a shorthand. The full figured bass is 7, 5, 3. But I know that I have a 4/3 suspension. So what I can do, I don't need the 5, I can still consider that presumed. I can write a 4, indicating that I'm acknowledging that there's a fourth at the arrival of that chord, and then I draw a line over, and then I write the suspension there. So that's how I can identify the intervals involved in the suspension. But in terms of labeling the suspension proper, the PSR will work for us. Okay, so that's one way I can create a suspension. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to go ahead and play this example first without the suspension. So I'll pretend that the A sharp arrives on the chord on time, so to speak, and then I'll play it with the delay. So we'll hear what it sounds like suspended. And now here we are with a delayed resolution in the tenor, resulting in a 4/3 suspension. Now let's see if we can do a 9/8 suspension. As I said earlier, we have an octave happening in both the soprano and in the tenor above the bass. However, only one of these is eligible for a 9/8 suspension. Here's why. The 9 implies that the suspended or the dissonant chord, or the non-chord tone, ends up being a ninth, which is kind of like saying a second above the bass, right? But remember, a suspended note begins its life as a carryover from a previous pitch, and so that means it has to enter the one chord at a ninth above the bass. Well, the only voice that's eligible to do that is the soprano, because it's a C sharp when, if carried over, will then be a ninth above the B in the bass. The tenor isn't eligible for that because its previous pitch is not a C sharp but an A sharp, right? So we could not in this case involve the tenor in a 9/8 suspension. So let's go ahead and let's do that with the soprano. So similar to what we did earlier, we will delay the arrival of the B by extending the duration of the C sharp. So since I've written a tie over the bar line, I don't need to reiterate the sharp, but I will have now my delayed resolution. And again, I'm going to label my preparation, my suspension, and my resolution. I can either use a bracket or a circle to indicate that I'm working with those soprano notes. Okay, so again, we'll play this passage without the suspension. And now we'll play it with the suspension. So there's an example of a 9/8 suspension. Okay. Well, we don't have any intervals of a sixth between the bass and any other voice, so this wouldn't be a good place to demonstrate a 7/6 suspension. We can do that elsewhere. We could, however, take a look at this 6/5 suspension. Notice how in the soprano we do have a voice that winds up being a fifth away from the bass in the second chord. Let me just restore this first pitch here in the soprano. Okay. So we can go ahead and create now a 6/5 suspension by delaying the arrival of the C sharp from the soprano's previous D. So here's what that would sound like with the soprano suspending now into the second chord rather than the third chord. So there's an example of a 6/5 suspension for us. The reason that I'm a little hesitant to talk about the 6/5 in terms of being a suspension, technically it is, and in most places you'll find that it is discussed. The difference between the 6/5 and these other ones is if you look at the other suspensions, if you look at that first interval in each case is a dissonant interval in its own right. A seventh is a dissonant interval. A fourth, we'll remember back from our earlier study, especially in terms of thinking of counterpoint, is technically considered a dissonance, as is a ninth, which of course is another way of saying a second, okay? And then of course the second itself. The sixth is one of our imperfect consonances. So even though it has a sense of suspending into a harmony for a 6/5 suspension, and there is that kind of sense of delay, it doesn't have the same kind of dissonance or the same kind of rub that we'll experience with some of these other suspensions. So we do discuss it, but it doesn't turn up quite as often. So I've reworked our example here to allow for the other suspensions we haven't discussed yet, both the 7/6 suspension, which will be available to a voice above the bass, and then the 2/3 suspension, which is a special circumstance involving the bass itself. So let's take a look at opportunities we have for a 7/6 suspension. Well, I know that the 6 means that I'm going to arrive finally at a consonant interval of a sixth above the bass, and the two voices that arrive at a sixth above the bass are the C sharp in the soprano here, the B in the soprano, and then the tenor having the B in the 1/6 chord as well. Well, the tenor is eliminated because remember that the arrival must come from above, right? So the suspended pitch begins as a chordal pitch here, it carries over, and then it resolves down to our chordal pitch. So obviously the tenor is disqualified because its prior pitch was below the B. The soprano, on the other hand, when it approaches the C sharp, it does so from a step above, so that could be a candidate. And when it approaches the B, it also approaches from the step above. Okay, so let's go ahead and try the resolution from the 1 chord into the 2/6 chord with a 7/6 suspension in the soprano. So very same process. I see what my voicing looks like with proper or I'll say on time arrivals, and then I'll just delay that sixth interval by just a little bit here. So I'll suspend the D is going to linger, and then resolve late to a C sharp. Okay, and again, just to check my intervals, from E to D is in fact a seventh, and then that D coming down to a C sharp while the E remains makes it a sixth. So here's what it sounded like back when the C sharp arrived right with the rest of the chord at the 2/6. And now with our 7/6 suspension in the soprano. And now we'll look at how a suspension in the bass creates actually a widening of the interval by delaying the resolution of the D, okay, by just a little bit. So what we'll do is, just as we've done with the others, we'll suspend the previous note, the E, into the 1 chord. Okay, so it's now a non-chordal pitch, which then resolves downward to the chordal pitch. Okay, so of course now that I've changed that arrival, these intervals change. Okay, so now the question comes, why would I call this a 2/3 suspension? Couldn't I just as easily pick any of the intervals above the bass, right? Because I've got a fifth from the bass to the tenor, that same fifth from the bass to the soprano, displaced by another octave. And then I have, of course, a second, right? A simplified interval would make that a second. So why do I choose the 2 to base my labeling of the suspension on? Well, so the rule is that we pick the voice above the bass that has the most, or that has the dissonance, right? So a fifth, of course, is like one of the ultimate. It's like a perfect consonance. So we wouldn't want to call it a 5/6 suspension. We want to emphasize the suspension's role as a dissonant non-chord tone. So we'll do that by calling out that second. Okay. So this we would call a 2/3 suspension. Okay, so let's see how it sounds. And, we'll go ahead and keep the soprano suspension in there as well. Why not? To me, that suspension in the bass, that 2/3 suspension is even more harmonically disturbing, I guess, for lack of a better word, than some of the other ones, but precisely because, of course, it is the bass that determines so much about the nature of a harmony. So much is wrapped up in the behavior of the bass that having it arrive to its chordal member in a delayed fashion just really causes a great interruption, a great a turning of the head, so to speak, within the music. So that's what makes 2/3 suspensions with bass motion really exciting. And of course, before I forget, I do want to make sure I label both of my suspensions here. So in the first example, I had the preparation, where the D was a chordal pitch here in the soprano. It suspended over to become a non-chordal pitch, and then it finally resolved to become chordal again. Okay. In the bass, the E began as a chordal pitch, so that was a preparation. A little more clearly. It suspended into the 1/6 where it was no longer a member of the chord, but then it resolved to become a member of the chord. Okay, so you see here I've grouped the notes together using a circle rather than a bracket. I'm just illustrating that either will work fine as long as we're just being very clear about which notes we're identifying as part of the suspension. So now I'm back to a version of my original example, and what I'd like to do here is show you how we can still identify suspensions and their resolutions, but when the bass itself changes. So some of the numeric labels we have are going to shift a little bit. So what you see I've done here is I've actually changed the harmony to result in a 1/6, and I have a 5 chord that starts off its life as a triad, but what I wanted to do here is I kind of use these figured bass symbols to show you what's happening to the rest of the intervals as the bass decides to step down using a passing tone here. We'd call that a passing 7th actually, down to resolve to 1/6, in the process becoming a 5/4/2 chord, if you recognize that. Okay, so what I'm going to do to illustrate how the suspension thing works in this instance is I'm going to go back to the soprano and give it a suspension that it had earlier, but the intervals are going to change, and we'll see how in just a second here. So we're going to again allow the soprano to sustain the D as a non-chord tone, and then finally resolve downward. Okay, let's get our label done. Still have a preparation here, suspension, and resolution. Okay, but now I want you to notice how the intervallic relationship with the bass has actually changed. Because the bass is stepping down, we still start off with a 6th above the bass in the soprano, and what would have resulted in a 5th had the bass stayed put on the F sharp. Well, it's no longer a 5th. What's happening now is the bass and the soprano are actually moving in parallel motion. So even though it's a suspension, this would be a special case, which would be a 6/6 suspension in the soprano. For no reason other than that the bass note is changing. Okay, so that's how that would change. Okay, now let's say I went ahead and did a resolution with the tenor. Okay, recreated what would have been a 4/3 suspension, where the tenor suspends the B, resolves it down to an A sharp. Okay, begins as a chordal tone. Okay, overstays its welcome, I suppose you could say, and then finally resolves down. Okay, now the relationship here. we still have the fourth we would have identified before, but like the soprano, it moves down by step in the same way that a bass does, or that the bass does. So this we would actually call a 4/4 suspension, right? Now, we don't see these all that commonly in terms of kind of just the off-the-cuff labels we use for these. We just kind of have to reinterpret the intervals of the suspensions because of, again, that bass motion. Okay, so I just wanted to quickly show you an example of that. So finally, I'll show you an example of a retardation. A retardation is very, very similar to a suspension in that it's a three-phase project, right? It's a pitch that arrives in a voice as a member of the chord. It suspends into, or I'll say it sustains rather, into a new chord where it is no longer a member, and then it resolves. The difference is, whereas the suspensions resolve down by step, retardations resolve up by step. And a very common place to see these retardations is with what I will call a lingering leading tone. Okay, so we have the leading tone in this example. We're back to our original example. We have the leading tone here in the tenor, which, as leading tones do, resolves up by step to the tonic pitch. Well, what would happen if we took that tenor and rather than have it resolve right away, we allowed it to resolve in a delayed fashion? So it's still going to resolve to the tonic pitch, but before it does that, it's just going to hang around on a sharp on the leading tone. Again, I'm not drawing the sharp because the tie kind of implies that I keep the accidental. Okay, so first of all, let's go ahead and label that. Just like suspensions, it's prepared, okay, and it's resolved. But because it's a retardation and not a suspension, that middle label we will call RET. Okay, so very similar labeling to the suspension because it behaves in a very similar manner. Just note that the retardation resolves upward. Okay, and so of course, just like we labeled the intervals with the suspensions, we'll label them with the retardation as well. Okay, so by the time the bass arrives, the A sharp has become a seventh. Okay, that's a tenor pitch there, and then it resolves to an 8. Okay, so this is something we could term a 7/8 retardation. So let's listen to what that sounds like. First, I'll play the original progression with on-time arrivals, and then I'll follow that up immediately with the same progression, but we'll have a retardation in the tenor. One compositional technique that was especially popular among Baroque composers was to create these chains of suspensions. And we can use just plain old root position triads and root position 5/7 chords to create a pretty simple chain of suspensions ourselves. So the way we'll start is as much as I have here. I have 4 voices all laid out, and we're beginning on a typical 1 chord, doubled root with a 3rd and a 5th, and I've got the 5th of the triad and the 3rd of the triad highlighted because we're going to use one of these 2 options to create our suspension chain. So here's how we'll create it. We'll kind of start off with just a basic chord progression where the 3rd, the voice with the 3rd, and the voice with the 5th, they're each going to essentially travel down until they get to the tonic. Coming from the 5th, it's pretty simple. You just go straight down the scale until you get there. But coming from the 3rd, you'll continue down into the leading tone and then resolve back up at the end of it. And so that'll be the basis for our suspension chain. The other 2 voices, they're just managing good voice leading, moving among these root position chords. So again, a root position 1 chord and root position 5/7 chord. You'll notice I have some leaps in the bass. And the reason I have the leaps in the bass is to avoid all voices arriving at any chord from the same direction. So I'm just kind of using the octave leaps for the bass to kind of make sure that at least one voice is going contrary to the other 3. So I've got it all set up here. I've got good voice leading. I do want to make note that the voice that starts off by doubling the bass, when it goes down to the leading tone, it will want to resolve in the next 1 chord down to the 5th. So we're going to go ahead and frustrate that leading tone, which we can do in an inner voice. And the reason that is because I'm going to need this voice to lead into the chordal 7th here. So just a quick note on that. So once I've got this set up, now what I'll do is I will go and I will pick one of these 2 voices, and I will essentially delay its arrival at each new chord, creating a suspension chain. So here I've created one of my two suspension chain options, delaying the resolutions in the soprano, which is the voice that started off with the chordal fifth. Remember, I can do the chains using the voice that starts with the fifth or the voice with the third. So now we'll look at the voice starting with the fifth. And so basically what I've done is I've simply just shifted over all of those resolutions one beat later. When I go to label my suspension, recall that suspensions happen when you prepare a pitch as part of a chord. It sustains over into the next chord where it isn't a member of the chord, and then it resolves down. So one thing I want you to notice when we start with the fifth, we do have this D that is sustained and holds itself over into this chord, but it's not yet a suspension because a suspension, remember, by definition is a non-chord tone, and D in this case is a member. In fact, it's doubling the root of our 5/7 chord. So it's kind of starting the pattern in terms of the rhythm, but it won't actually become a suspension until a little bit later. Okay, so in fact, what happens here is we have a D that resolves down into the chordal seventh, right? So it's still part of the chord, but now watch this. When it moves over, it's part of the chordal seventh, but it sustains into the one chord where it is no longer a member of the chord. So now we can begin to use our labeling where we label this one a preparation because it's part of the chord, and then here it's suspending over because it's no longer part of the chord, even though it's hanging on to the same pitch that it had in the previous chord. And now here we see it resolving down to a member of the one chord. Okay, so there is our first suspension. Now watch, here's what makes this a chain. This resolution also serves as the preparation for the next suspension. So I'm going to use this pitch now as a preparation. Okay, and then it holds over. It becomes a non-chord tone, so it's a suspension here, okay, and then the B resolves down to A, which is a member, again, of the 5/7 chord. Okay, and now sure enough, this resolution has again become a preparation for the next suspension. So the A serves as a preparation because it's again part of the 5/7 chord. It hangs on into the one chord where it's no longer a member of the chord, so it's a suspension, and then it resolves down. Okay, so let's go ahead and label these suspensions just so we can see what they're doing. Okay, remember this this first tie that we see here is not a suspension, right? Because it's tying over into a member of the chord, and it goes down into that into the C, so it's still a member of the chord. It's the chordal seventh. But now let's see what happens when we get to the one chord in the second measure. Now we have a C that's against a G in the bass. Okay, so G up to C is a fourth, so we have a fourth, and we expect that, knowing our suspensions, to resolve to a third. And sure enough, the C resolves down to a B, creating a third with the bass. So there we have a 4/3 suspension. And remember that resolution, or the B in this case, also serves as a preparation for the next suspension. So let's see what the B looks like when it's suspended into the 5/7 against the D. Okay, D up to B is a sixth, and the sixth resolves down to a fifth. So this would be our 6/5 suspension. And our last suspension, we'll take a look at the A, the half note A at the soprano near the very end here. Okay, G to A. We know that that's a second, but in suspension language, we'll just kind of add an octave to that and call it a ninth. So here we have a 9, and the A resolves down to a G at the octave. So there is a 9/8 suspension. So this is one example of a suspension chain that we can create using just tonic and dominant harmonies. So now we've created a suspension chain now using the voice which was sounding the third in the original tonic triad, which for us is in the tenor here. Okay, so a very similar process to what we did before. We're going to look and see how this chain of suspensions is going to play out, including resolutions of a suspension that doubly serve as a preparation for the next suspension. So we have a B, which carries over into the 5 chord. And if we recall, our first tie when we started off here with the 5th of the tonic triad, our first tie wasn't a suspension because it was part of the chord. Well, in this case, the B is not actually part of our 5 chord, so we get a suspension right away. So the original B serves as a preparation. This B is the suspension, and of course it resolves down. And if it's anything like our last experience, we'll expect this chain to kind of continue, where our resolution is also our preparation. And sure enough, the A, which I've just resolved to, is chordal in 5/7, but it is not chordal in our 1 chord. And as you can see the second right here at the bass, but still, just for consistency's sake, we'll eventually label that a 9/8 suspension. Okay, but first let's go ahead and mark our preparation, our suspension, then our resolution. Okay, and as we expect, this resolution, the G is part of the 1 chord, which prepares it for the next suspension, because G is no longer part of the 5/7 chord. So we'll label it accordingly. We prepare, we suspend, and we resolve, and of course it's just a suspension, just reminding us that we always resolve down. Now, check this out here. The F sharp, we're at our leading tone, and in our original progression, the leading tone of course resolved straight up, which it's going to do here, but it's going to do a delayed resolution, but notice how it resolves upward. When you begin with the 3rd and use that to create your suspension from the original 1 chord, at the end of the progression, you'll actually end up not with a suspension, but because this carried over note is resolving up, this is actually a retardation. So we will label it using that labeling. So the F sharp is still a preparation. Make that a little more clear. Continuing the F sharp, it's no longer a suspension. We now will label it a retardation, and then it resolves up. Okay, so there is our suspension chain with a special guest appearance by a retardation. Okay, we'll go ahead and label our intervals here. So in the first suspension, I see that I have the bass is D against the suspended B here. So that's going to be a 6th, and it resolves down to a 5th against the bass. So that will be our 6/5 suspension. And then in the next suspension, again, I see that these two notes kind of rubbing together here, and I know that that's a 2nd, but for the sake of suspension language, we'll go ahead and call that a 9/8 suspension. Okay, and the next one, when the G arrives, when the bass arrives at a D, the G is already there. It's creating a 4th, which then resolves to a 3rd. So now I have a 4/3 suspension. Okay, and now I get to my retardation. The retardation arrives as a 7th, and then it resolves to an 8th. So this is our 7/8 retardation. Okay, so there's a fairly straightforward way of creating a chain of suspensions. I went ahead and used my notation software to just go ahead and punch in these notes so you can get a sense of what it sounds like with these suspension chains. And now, just to have a bit of fun, I have an example here of the same progression we had with our retardation, and now I've thrown in a couple of suspensions to boot. Okay, so we have a 9/8 suspension in the soprano, we have a 4/3 suspension in the alto, and I've kept my 7/8 retardation in the tenor. And notice how I've used figured bass symbols to kind of label all of those next to the 1 chord. Okay, so let's hear what that sounds like. Listen to it again and listen to how I really make a big deal out of emphasizing those dissonances that arrive on the final downbeat. So those are our delayed resolutions, our suspensions and retardations.